What if Robb Stark kept his promise? Not because he wanted to, not because she was beautiful, or because the match made his heart do the thing that songs were written about. Robb Stark, at 16, had his father's sword and his father's war and 50,000 men who needed to cross a bridge, and the bridge belonged to a man who wanted his blood in Winterfell, and the price of the crossing was a daughter. He could have said no. He could have found another way south, taken the long road, lost the weeks that would have cost him the Whispering Wood and Jaime Lannister and possibly everything. He could have done what he did in another telling of this story, which was to say yes, and then marry someone else, and let the promise rot and see what rotting promises produced. What rotting promises produced was the Red Wedding. But what if Robb Stark, who was his father's son, who had watched Ned Stark keep promises that cost him everything, who understood in his bones that the man who gives his word and breaks it is not a man anyone should follow into anything, looked at the bridge and the old lord and the deal and said, "Fine, I'll marry your daughter. Which one?" This is a story about what happens when you keep the promise you don't want to keep. When you do the thing that isn't the thing you'd choose. When you marry a girl you've never met because your mother made a deal with an old man at a bridge and your father raised you to believe that deals, once made, are kept. It is also, and this is the part that surprised everyone, including Robb, a love story. Not immediately, not dramatically, not the way the songs describe it, the way his parents had done it, which was, slowly, honestly, with work, in the spaces between the things that were trying to kill them. That kind. The twins. The deal. 298 AC. The army needed the bridge. This was not a negotiable fact. 50,000 men on the wrong side of the Green Fork, with a war to fight, and the only crossing controlled by a man who had spent 90 years accumulating grievances and daughters in roughly equal proportion. Walder Frey had been sitting at the twins for longer than most of the men in Robb's army had been alive, and he had developed the specific patience of someone who knows that eventually everyone needs his bridge. Catelyn went to negotiate. She came back with the terms. Robb listened. He was in the command tent with his bannermen, the Greatjon, Karstark, Glover, the men who had come south because Ned Stark was dead, and the north was angry, and anger needed a direction. They were planning the war. They were not planning a wedding. Catelyn laid it out. The bridge, the crossing, the Frey men, 4,000 swords that would join the host, not inconsiderable. And the price. Arya would marry one of Walder's sons when the war was over, and Robb would marry one of Walder's daughters. Now, before the crossing, before the war, the tent went quiet. Robb said, "Which daughter?" Catelyn said. "He'll let you choose." Robb said, "From how many?" Catelyn said, "He has..." She paused. "Several. The Greatjon, who had the tact of a man who had never in his life needed tact and saw no reason to start. You want the boy to marry a Frey?" Catelyn said, "I want the boy to cross the bridge." The Greatjon said, "There are other bridges." Catelyn said, "Name one that gets us to the Whispering Wood in time to save Riverrun." The Greatjon did not name one. Robb sat with the information. He was 16, and he was learning, in the compressed and unforgiving way that war taught things, that leadership was not the thing you chose, but the thing that chose you. And it chose you by presenting you with decisions that had no good options and requiring you to pick the least bad one. He thought about his father. Not the dead father, the living one, the one who had sat him down at 12 and told him about how he had married Catelyn Tully. Not for love, not because his heart demanded it, because his brother was dead and the alliance was needed, and the Tully swords were the difference between winning the rebellion and losing it. And Ned Stark had married a woman he did not know, and had built something with her that was stronger than most loves that started with the heart. He had said, "The building is the thing. The start doesn't matter as much as people think. It's what you build after the start." Robb had been 12. He had understood it the way 12-year-olds understand things their fathers tell them, which is, imperfectly, but with the shape of the thing stored somewhere. It would be useful later. Later was now. He said, I'll do it. The tent shifted. Not with relief, exactly. With the specific settling of men who had been holding their breath and could now hold something else instead. Catelyn looked at him. He looked back. She said, "You're sure?" He said, "Father married you because the war needed it. He kept his promise. He built something real." He held her gaze. "I can do the same." She was quiet for a moment. Something in her face that was not entirely grief and not entirely pride and was probably both. She said, "Yes, you can." He said, "Set it up. We cross tomorrow." She went to write the Raven. The twins, Roslin, 298 AC. Walder Frey lined them up. This was the part that Robb had been dreading, not the marriage itself, which was a political instrument and could be managed as one, but the choosing, the parade of it, the specific humiliation of standing in a hall and looking at a row of women and picking one the way you'd pick a horse. He was not going to do it that way. He told Catelyn, "I'm not choosing from a lineup. Ask Lord Frey to send whoever he thinks is the best match. I'll trust his judgment." Catelyn said, "You want to trust Walder Frey's judgment?" Robb said, "I want to not treat his daughters like livestock at auction. If he sends someone terrible, I'll manage." Catelyn said, "Robb." He said, "Mother, Father didn't pick you from a lineup. He was told he was marrying Catelyn Tully, and he married Catelyn Tully. I can do the same." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I'll tell him." She told him. Walder Frey, who had expected the inspection and had prepared for it with the specific combination of eagerness and resentment that characterized everything he did, was briefly thrown by the refusal. He had been planning to watch the young lord's face as he looked at his daughters. He had been looking forward to it in the way that small men looked forward to moments where larger men were uncomfortable. The refusal denied him this. He sent Roslin. She came to the Great Hall at the Twins on a Wednesday afternoon, which was not the afternoon anyone had planned for a meeting that would determine the rest of two people's lives, and she stood in the doorway, and Robb looked at her, and the first thing he thought was, "She's afraid." Not of him specifically, of the situation, of the specific terrifying machinery of being a young woman whose father had traded her for a military alliance with a boy she had never met, who was fighting a war that might kill him before the marriage was a month old. She was afraid, and she was managing it, and the management was costing her, and he could see the cost, because he had spent 16 years watching his father manage things that cost him, and he knew what it looked like. She was small, dark-haired, pretty in a way that was not dramatic, but that held the kind of face that improved with attention, rather than diminishing with it. She had her hands clasped in front of her, in the specific way of someone who doesn't know what to do with their hands, and has chosen the option that makes them smallest. He crossed the room. He didn't wait for her to come to him. He crossed the room because she shouldn't have to walk the length of a great hall with everyone watching, and if someone was going to be uncomfortable walking, it should be him, because he was the one with the army and the options, and she was the one who'd been sent. He stopped in front of her. He said, "I'm Robb Stark." She said, "I know." Her voice was quiet. Steady, but quiet. "I'm Roslin," he said. "I know." He paused. "I want to say something before any of the formal part." She looked at him. The fear was still there, but something else had arrived beside it, which was attention. She was paying attention to him in the way of someone assessing whether the situation was going to be what she'd feared or something else. He said, "I didn't choose this. You didn't choose this. Our parents made an arrangement, and here we are." He held her gaze. "But I am choosing to keep the promise, and I want you to know that the keeping is not reluctant. I'm not doing this because I have to. I'm doing it because my father taught me that promises kept are the foundation of everything else." She was quiet. He said, "I don't know you. You don't know me. We're going to have to build everything from the ground up. My parents did that. It worked." He paused. "I'd like to try." She said, That's She stopped. She looked at her hands, then back at him. That's the most honest thing anyone has said to me in my entire life, he said. Get used to it. I'm not good at the other thing. Something happened in her face. Not a smile. Something before a smile. The preparation for one. The place a smile would go if the situation ever became safe enough for smiling. She said, When? He said, Tomorrow. Is that too fast? She said, My father has been planning this for 3 days. Everything is ready. He was planning to make you wait a week to show he could. She paused. He won't like tomorrow. Robb said, Good. The almost smile became an actual smile. It was small. It was quick. It was genuine, he thought. All right, we can work with this. The wedding, what it cost. The wedding was held in the Sept at the Twins on a Thursday morning that was cold and overcast, which was appropriate for an event that was primarily a military transaction dressed in the clothing of a ceremony. It was not the wedding Robb had imagined. He had imagined, when he'd imagined it at all, which was rarely and mostly in the abstract way that 16-year-olds imagine futures. Something at Winterfell. The gods would. Snow on the ground, his father standing beside him, and his mother across from him, and the specific northern quality of a ceremony that didn't need to be more than what it was. Instead, a Sept at the Twins. Walder Frey in the front row with the expression of a man who had won something and wanted everyone to know it. The Lords of the North behind them with the expression of men attending a necessity. Grey Robb circling somewhere outside, which was Ghost's contribution to the proceedings. Roslin stood across from him. She had been dressed by her family in the specific way that families dress their daughters for weddings that are also alliances. Too much. Too formal. The gown and the jewels, and the arrangement of hair that said, We are giving you our best. Look at what our best is. Be impressed. She was wearing all of it with the careful patience of someone who understood that the outfit was for her father, not for her. The Septon spoke the words. Robb said his part. Roslin said hers. Her voice did not shake, which he noticed and filed as information about who she was. They were married. Walder Frey was satisfied. The satisfaction radiated from him in the specific way of a man who had spent 90 years feeling overlooked and had finally arranged something that could not be overlooked. His blood would be in Winterfell. His grandchildren would be Starks. He had won the only game he had ever cared about, which was the long game of family position, played across decades with the specific patience of a man who had nothing else to do. The feast was loud, and Robb endured it, and Roslin sat beside him, and they did not speak much, which was not uncomfortable so much as honest. There was nothing to say that wasn't either too large for a feast, or too small for the occasion. After the feast, in the chamber that had been prepared for them, they were alone for the first time. Robb closed the door. He turned. She was standing by the window, which had the specific posture of someone who had chosen the point in the room furthest from the bed, and was making a statement about it without saying anything. He said, I'm going to sleep on the floor. She looked at him. He said, Not because I'm not making a point, I'm saying tonight is... This was a long day, and neither of us knows the other, and I'm not going to... He stopped. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this. I'm going to sleep on the floor, and you're going to have the bed, and in the morning we'll be married, and we can figure out the rest of it at whatever speed makes sense. She looked at him for a long moment. She said, The floor is stone. He said, I've been sleeping on the ground for 2 months. She said, The bed is large enough for 2 people to share it without... She stopped. Without anything that isn't sleeping. He looked at her. She said, I'm not afraid of you. I was this morning. I'm not now. She held his gaze. You walked across the hall. You didn't make me come to you. You said the honest thing when you could have said the impressive thing. She paused. I've been living in this castle for 17 years. I know what men do in this castle. You're not that. He said. How do you know? She said. Because men who are that don't sleep on the floor. He almost laughed. He didn't sleep on the floor. They slept in the bed, on opposite sides, with a careful and very specific distance between them that was neither cold nor warm, but was honest, which was the only thing available. In the morning, she was still there. In the morning, the army crossed the bridge. The crossing. What the marriage brought. 50,000 men and 4,000 Frey swords crossed the Green Fork on a Friday morning, and the war changed. Not because of the Frey soldiers, though they were useful. 4,000 men was 4,000 men, and in the specific arithmetic of medieval warfare, that was the difference between a difficult campaign and a possible one. The war changed because the crossing happened at the right time. Jaime Lannister was at River Run, the Lannister host was divided, and Robb Stark, who had been learning the art of war in the compressed and unforgiving way that war taught it, had 3 days to get to the Whispering Wood before the window closed. He got there in 2. The battle at the Whispering Wood was the kind of engagement that military historians would analyze for decades, not because it was large, but because it was clean. Robb had seen where the Lannister cavalry would be, because the terrain told him where it would be, and he had put his men where the terrain told him to put them, and when the engagement began, it lasted 3 hours, and at the end of it, Jaime Lannister was in chains, and the Lannister position in the Riverlands had been cut open from the inside. Robb came back to camp with blood on his armor, and Jaime Lannister behind him, and found Roslin. She was standing at the edge of the camp with the camp followers and the non-combatants, and she had the specific expression of someone who had spent 3 hours not knowing whether her husband was alive, and had been managing the not knowing with the careful discipline of someone who understood that falling apart was not an option available to the wife of the commander. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was 16 years old and covered in another man's blood, and he had just won his first battle. And what he felt, looking at her, was not the dramatic surge that songs described, but something more useful, which was relief that she was there. The specific, practical, non-dramatic relief of a person who had been doing something hard and came back to find something steady. She said, "You're not hurt." He said, "No." She said, "Good." She paused. "There's food in your tent. You should eat before you do whatever comes next." He said, "There's a lot that comes next." She said, "I know. Eat first." He went to eat. He ate. Then he did whatever came next. Catelyn and Roslin, what wasn't said. Catelyn had brokered the deal that brought Roslin into the family, and Catelyn was the one who had to live with what the deal produced, and the living with it was more complicated than the brokering. She had expected, she would admit this later to Robb in one of their quiet conversations, she had expected a Frey, by which she meant she had expected the Frey qualities, the specific Walder Frey inheritance of grievance and calculation, and the thin-skinned awareness of where one sat in the hierarchy. She had expected someone she would have to manage. What she got was Roslin. Roslin was quiet. Not the quiet of someone who had nothing to say. Catelyn recognized the difference immediately, because Ned had been this kind of quiet, and she had spent 20 years learning to read it. Roslin was quiet because she was listening, and she was listening because she had spent 17 years in a castle full of people who did not listen to her, and she had developed the specific compensating skill of listening to everything. She noticed things. She noticed that Robb didn't eat when he was worried, which Catelyn knew but which Roslin identified within the first week and handled by putting food in his tent without making a production of it. She noticed that the supply officer was skimming. Not much, not enough to be obvious, but enough that Roslin's 17 years of watching her father's household accounts, which were extensive and badly managed, had given her the specific eye for numbers that don't add up. She noticed that Theon Greyjoy was unhappy in a way that was going to become a problem if someone didn't address it, and she mentioned this to Robb, who mentioned it to Catelyn, who did not mention it to Theon but adjusted her approach to him. Catelyn watched all of this. On the 3rd week, she went to Roslin. She found her in the tent that served as the quartermaster's overflow, which was where Roslin had apparently been spending her mornings, helping the supply officers organize the provisions in a way that Catelyn had been told was considerably more efficient than the previous system. She said, "Walk with me." Roslin walked with her. They went to the edge of camp, where the noise dropped to the level that allowed conversation, and Catelyn said, "You're reorganizing the supply chain." Roslin said, "I'm helping. The officer, Gregor, the tall one. He's good at procurement but bad at storage. They were losing 20% of the grain to damp. It's a positioning problem. Catelyn said, "You know supply management." Roslin said, "My father has 800 people in the Twins at any given time. Someone has to feed them." She paused. "He doesn't notice who does it. He notices when it isn't done." Catelyn was quiet for a moment. She said, "I owe you an apology." Roslin said, "You don't." Catelyn said, "I brokered this marriage as a transaction. I treated you as a price. I didn't think about who you were because who you were wasn't relevant to what I needed, which was the bridge." She held Roslin's gaze. "That was wrong of me. Not because the decision was wrong. The bridge was necessary. But I should have thought about you as a person and not as a toll." Roslin looked at her. She said, "Lady Catelyn." Catelyn said, "Yes." Roslin said, "My father has been trading his children for position since before I was born. I have 16 siblings who have been married to people they didn't choose for reasons that had nothing to do with them." She paused. "You are the first person who has ever apologized for it." Catelyn said nothing. Roslin said, "And you're the first person who didn't need to, because what you did it for your son. You did it for the war. You did it because the bridge was necessary." She held Catelyn's gaze. "My father trades us for spite. You traded me for your children. Those are not the same thing." Catelyn looked at this 17-year-old girl who had been living in Walder Frey's castle for her entire life, and had somehow come out of it with the capacity to make that distinction. She said, "You're going to do well here." Roslin said, "I'm going to try." Catelyn said, "No, you're going to do well. There's a difference between trying and doing well, and you've already crossed it." She didn't say anything else. She walked back to camp. She went to find Robb. As she found him at the maps, she said, "Your wife." He looked up. She said, "She's remarkable." He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" He said, "Yes." He held her gaze. "I've been paying attention." She said, "Good." She looked at the maps. "Then pay attention to this too. The supply chain she reorganized is saving us 3 days of provisions per month. Your wife just extended the campaign by a season." He sat with that. He said, "She told me about the grain storage." She said, "She told you?" He said, "She tells me things. Useful things. The kind of things that..." He stopped. "The kind of things you tell father." Catelyn looked at him. He heard himself. He said, "Told father." She said, "I know what you meant." They were quiet for a moment. She said, "This is how it starts. What your father and I had." She held his gaze. "Not with love, with noticing, with paying attention to what the other person does and finding it valuable." She paused. "The love comes from the noticing, not the other way around." He looked at the maps. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Robb and Roslin. The first months, 298 AC. The first months were work. Not the dramatic work of songs. Not the sweeping gesture. Not the moment of revelation. Not the look across the battlefield that said everything words couldn't. The work was more like masonry. Brick by brick. Conversation by conversation. The slow accumulation of knowing someone that happened when you shared a tent and a war, and the specific intimacy of being the two people in the camp who had chosen each other, even though neither of them had chosen each other. She told him about the twins. Not all at once, in pieces, over weeks, in the specific way that people shared difficult histories, which was a piece when it was safe, then a pause to see if the piece was received well, then another piece. She told him about Walder Frey, who was her father, and who was also the specific kind of man who made fatherhood feel like a transaction rather than a relationship. She told him about her siblings, the ones she was close to, and the ones she wasn't, and the ones who had been married off to lords who treated them as accessories rather than people. She told him about the specific education of growing up in a house, where your primary value was your marriageability, And your secondary value was your ability to manage the things that needed managing without anyone noticing you were doing it. He listened. He was good at listening. This was not a skill he had developed intentionally. It was more like a quality he had inherited from Ned, the specific ability to hold space for someone else's story without needing to insert his own. He listened, and he asked questions that showed he was listening, and he remembered things she said and brought them back later in context, which he found both surprising and disorienting because nobody at the twins had ever done this. She told him about the crying. Not immediately. This came later, in the second month, on a night when the rain was hitting the tent, and neither of them could sleep, and the dark made difficult things easier to say. She said, "I cried when my father told me." He said, "About the marriage." She said, "Not about the marriage, about..." She stopped. "He told me what he was going to do. If you didn't come, if you didn't honor the agreement." She paused. "He told me what he was planning." The tent was dark, and the rain was loud, and Robb went very still. He said, "What was he planning?" She said, "I can't. Not the details. But..." She looked at the ceiling, which was tent canvas and rain. "He had an arrangement with Lord Bolton. If the crossing didn't happen, if the marriage didn't happen, if you found another way south or broke the promise..." She stopped. He was going to make sure the North didn't win. Robb was quiet for a long time. He said, "Rose Bolton." She said, "He came to the twins. Before you did. He sat with my father for 2 hours." She paused. "I served them wine. They didn't notice I was there. People don't notice the daughters." She held her breath. "He offered my father something. I don't know what. But my father, he had a plan. For if you said no." Robb lay in the dark. He thought about Bolton, who smiled the wrong way, who agreed too readily, whose eyes were the color of frozen water. He thought about the back of his neck going tight every time Bolton entered a room. He said, "You're telling me this now." She said, "I didn't know how to tell you before. I didn't know if you'd believe me. I didn't know if..." She stopped. "I didn't know if you'd think I was trying to cause trouble between you and your bannerman for my own reasons." He said, "What reasons would those be?" She said, "My father's, the Frey reasons." She turned to face him in the dark. "I'm a Frey. I know what people think that means." He said, "You're a Stark." She said, "I'm a Stark for 3 weeks. I've been a Frey for 17 years. He said, "And you're telling me about Bolton because..." She said, "Because you need to know. Because the man sitting in your war council made an arrangement with my father that involved you not surviving the war. And you're not going to find that out from anyone else. Because my father will never tell you, and Bolton will never tell you. And the only person who was in the room was a girl pouring wine that nobody noticed." She held his gaze in the dark. "I'm telling you because you married me, and you slept on your side of the bed, and you let me reorganize your supply chain, and you listened when I talked, and I think..." She stopped. "I think you're worth keeping alive." The rain hit the tent. Ghost, who was outside and should not have been able to hear a conversation at this volume, made a sound. Robb said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me. Deal with Bolton." He said, "I will." She said, "Before he deals with you." He said, "I'm aware of the timeline." She said, "Are you?" He looked at her in the dark. He said, "You sound like my mother." She said, "Your mother is a smart woman." He said, "Yes." They were quiet for a moment. He said, "Roslin." She said, "Yes." He said, "The distance." On the bed. He paused. "It can be smaller, if you want." She was quiet. She moved closer. Not all the way. Closer. It was enough. It was the start. Bolton. What Robb did with the information. He didn't move immediately. This was the thing Catelyn had taught him. Not the lesson she intended, but the lesson he absorbed. which was that the first response to dangerous information was not action, but assessment. You sat with it. You let it settle. You looked at it from every angle available, and you decided what it meant before you decided what to do about it. Because acting on dangerous information without understanding it was how people got killed. He sat with it for 6 days. On the first day, he watched Bolton in the War Council and saw what Roslin had told him he would see, which was a man who agreed too readily, who supported every plan with the specific enthusiasm of someone who did not care which plan was chosen, because the plan was not the thing he was invested in. Bolton was invested in something else, something behind the plans, and now that Robb knew to look for it, it was visible in the way that things were visible once you had been told they were there. On the third day, he talked to the Great John, not about Bolton specifically. He asked the Great John about loyalty, what it looked like, how you tested it, how you knew the difference between a man who followed you because he believed in the cause and a man who followed you because the following was currently useful and would stop being useful at a specific, calculable moment. The Great John said, "You look at what they do when nobody's watching. The ones who are with you in the tent at 3 a.m. when there's nothing to gain from being there. The ones who aren't, they're somewhere else." Robb said, "Where's Bolton at 3 a.m? The Great John was quiet for a moment. He said, "I don't know." Robb said, "Find out." The Great John found out. Bolton was writing letters. Not to the north. The Great John's man had seen the seals, and they weren't northern seals. They were going south, to the Twins, and, through the Twins, to King's Landing. On the 6th day, Robb called Bolton to his tent. He did it alone. Catelyn had argued against alone. She had argued for witnesses, for guards, for the specific political machinery that protected you when you confronted a dangerous man. Robb had listened to her, and had decided against it. Not because she was wrong, but because what he was about to do required the man across from him to understand that Robb Stark was not afraid, and being alone in a tent with a dangerous man communicated that in a way that guards and witnesses did not. Bolton came. He sat across from Robb with the specific, comfortable stillness of a man who had never in his life been surprised by a confrontation, because he had always planned for them. Robb said, "You went to the Twins before I did." Bolton's face did not change. Robb said, "You sat with Walder Frey for 2 hours. You discussed what would happen if I didn't honor the marriage pact." He held Bolton's gaze. "You made an arrangement." Bolton said, "Who told you this?" Robb said, "That's not the question I need answered." Bolton said, "What is the question?" Robb said, "The question is what I do with you." The tent was quiet. Bolton said, "I serve the North." Robb said, "You serve yourself. You've been serving yourself for 20 years. The North is the vehicle, not the destination." He leaned forward. "I know about the letters, south, through the Twins, to whoever in King's Landing is willing to negotiate a Bolton wardenship of the North in exchange for a Stark defeat." Bolton's eyes did not change. This was its own kind of confirmation. A man who was innocent would have shown surprise. A man who was guilty showed the specific absence of surprise that meant he had been waiting for this moment and had a plan for it. Robb said, "Here's what happens now." Bolton said nothing. Robb said, "You go home. Not north, home. To the Dreadfort. You take your men and you go. And you stay there. And you manage your lands. And you do not write letters south. And you do not make arrangements with men who want me dead." He held the gaze. "I'm not executing you. I'm not stripping your titles. I'm sending you home." Bolton said, "Why?" Robb said, "Because killing you makes a martyr, and stripping your titles makes an enemy, and sending you home makes you irrelevant." He paused. "I learned that from my mother." Bolton looked at him. He said, "Your mother?" Robb said, "She's smarter than both of us. Accept the offer." Bolton was quiet for a long time. He was running the calculation. Robb could see him running it. The specific cold mathematics of a man who had spent his life calculating outcomes. The calculation said, "The boy knows." The boy has evidence. The boy is offering you your life and your castle and your irrelevance. And the alternative is a trial that you will lose because the evidence exists and the boy's mother will prosecute it. He said, "When?" Robb said, "Tomorrow." Bolton left in the morning with his men and his banners and the specific quiet that surrounded him like weather. He rode north without speaking to anyone, and the camp was lighter when he was gone, which is a thing that people noticed without being able to explain. The air was different when the man with the frozen eyes was not breathing it. Roslin was standing at the tent when Robb came back from watching Bolton's column disappear. She said, "He went." Robb said, "He went." She said, "Will he stay gone?" Robb said, "For now. The calculation says staying gone is the better option." He looked at her. "Thank you for the information," she said. "I told you. Don't thank me." He said, "I'm going to thank you anyway," she said. "Then you're welcome." She looked at the horizon where Bolton's column had been. He'll try again. Eventually. Men like my father and men like Bolton, they don't stop. They wait. He said, "Then we'll be ready." She said, "Yes." They went inside. The war. What the Frey alliance brought. Without Bolton's treachery, the northern campaign held. This was the specific and non-obvious consequence of a marriage that most of the lords had treated as a political embarrassment, and that was turning out to be the structural foundation of the entire war effort. The Frey bridge was open. The supply lines ran through the twins without interruption. Walder Frey, who had his blood in Winterfell and his grandson on the way. Roslin was pregnant by the 3rd month, which she told Robb on a Tuesday morning over breakfast, with the flat northern delivery she had been absorbing from the camp, was invested in the northern victory in a way that no amount of political maneuvering could have produced. He was invested because his grandchild would be a Stark. He was invested because for the first time in 90 years, the Frey name was attached to something that was winning rather than something that was waiting. He sent more men. He opened his stores. He did the thing that Walder Frey had never done in his entire life, which was to be generous. Because generosity was suddenly in his interest, and Walder Frey had always been very good at identifying his interest. Catelyn watched this with the expression of a woman who had solved a problem she hadn't known she was solving. She said to Robb, "Your father-in-law is going to be the most reliable ally we have." Robb said, "Because his grandson is our heir." Catelyn said, "Because his grandson is the thing he has spent 90 years wanting. A Frey who is also a Stark. A Frey whose name people say with respect instead of contempt." She paused. "He's going to fight for this harder than anyone, because this is not a war to him. This is the end of 90 years of being the man everyone walks past." Robb said, "That's..." Catelyn said, "Useful. That's what it is." The war went well. Robb had the Whispering Wood. He had Jaime Lannister in chains. He had the Frey Bridge, and the Frey men, and the supply lines running, and Bolton neutralized at the Dreadfort, and the specific momentum that success produced in a medieval campaign, which was, other people wanted to join the side that was winning. The Riverlands lords came in, not all at once, in the specific way that regional lords committed to causes, which was one at a time, each one waiting to see what the one before him had gotten before deciding what to ask for. Catelyn managed this. She managed it the way she managed everything, which was with the specific efficiency of a woman who had spent 20 years running Winterfell and understood that logistics was the art of making things possible rather than the art of making things dramatic. Robb fought the battles. Roslin managed the camp. This division of labor was not planned. It emerged the way useful things emerge, through the specific process of two people discovering what they were good at and settling into it. Robb was good at the field, at the terrain, at the reading of a landscape that told you where the enemy would be and where your men should go. He had the Stark quality of looking at a problem and seeing the shape of the solution inside it. Roslin was good at the rest. The provisions, the morale, the specific human infrastructure of an army that was more than soldiers. The families, the followers, the wounded, the maesters, the smiths, the bakers, the laundresses, the 100 people who made it possible for the soldiers to soldier. She had been managing a household of 800 since she was 14, and she transferred the skills without noticing she was doing it. And the camp ran better than any camp in the north had run in living memory. The lords noticed. They noticed the way lords noticed things that worked, not by praising them, but by stopping complaining. The specific absence of complaint was the highest form of northern approval. Lady Mormont came to Roslin on the 4th month. She said, "You're a Frey." Roslin said, "Yes." Lady Mormont said, "You're running this camp better than most lords run their castles." Roslin said, "Thank you." Lady Mormont said, "That wasn't a compliment. It was an observation." She looked at her. Compliments would suggest surprise. "I'm not surprised." She paused. Women who grow up in difficult houses learn to manage things. The more difficult the house, the better the management. She held Roslin's gaze. "You grew up in the most difficult house in the Riverlands. I expected competence." Roslin said, "Is that a compliment?" Lady Mormont said, "That's recognition." She walked away. Roslin watched her go. She thought, "I have been waiting my entire life for someone to say that." She went back to the supply ledgers. Theon. What he didn't do. 299 AC. Theon Greyjoy watched the marriage from the back of the hall at the Twins with the expression of a man doing mathematics he didn't like the answer to. He had been with Robb since Winterfell. He had ridden south with the host and fought at the Whispering Wood, and done the things that were asked of him, and done them well enough that nobody questioned his presence, which was its own kind of success for a man who had spent his life being questioned about everything. He was supposed to go to the Iron Islands. This was the plan. Robb's plan, brokered with Catelyn, to send Theon to Balon Greyjoy with an offer of alliance. The Greyjoy fleet in exchange for recognition and autonomy. It was a good plan on paper. It was a terrible plan in practice because it required Theon Greyjoy to walk into his father's stronghold and be both a Stark emissary and a Greyjoy son. And those two things were not compatible, and Theon had been living in the gap between them for 10 years. Roslin noticed. She noticed because noticing was what she did. And what she noticed about Theon was the specific restlessness of a man who was about to make a decision he'd regret. She had seen this in her brothers. The Frey boys, who had been sent to other houses and who came back wrong, changed by the experience of being between two loyalties in a way that the between hadn't resolved, but had sharpened into something dangerous. She went to Robb. She said, "Don't send Theon to the Iron Islands." He said, "The Alliance?" She said, "Send someone else. Send a lord. Send a formal delegation with gifts and terms." She held his gaze. "Don't send the hostage home to his father, who resents you." He said, "Theon's not a hostage." She said, "He's been a hostage for 10 years. Your father treated him well, and he loves you. And none of that changes the fact that he is, structurally, a man who was taken from his family at 9 years old and has been living in someone else's house ever since." She paused. "I know what it's like to live in someone else's house. I know what it does. You survive it, and you're grateful. And underneath the surviving and the gratefulness, there is a thing that never healed. And if you put that thing back in the place where the wound happened..." She stopped. "Don't do it." Robb looked at her. He said, "You've been thinking about this." She said, "I've been watching him since the wedding. He looks at you the way a man looks at someone he loves and resents in equal measure. And the balance between those two is precarious." She held his gaze. "Keep him close. Give him something to do. Something that's his, not yours. Something that makes him feel like he chose to be here, rather than being kept here." He said, "What would that look like?" She said, "I don't know. But I know what it doesn't look like. And it doesn't look like sending him to his father." Robb didn't send Theon to the Iron Islands. He sent Lord Glover instead, with a formal delegation and terms that were generous enough to be interesting and cautious enough to be credible. Balon Greyjoy rejected the alliance, because Balon Greyjoy rejected everything that came from the mainland on principle, but he rejected it without the specific ammunition that having his son in the room would have provided, and without the specific crisis that sending Theon would have produced. Theon stayed with the army. He stayed, and he fought, and he was angry about staying in the way that people were angry about things that were both wrong and right. And over the months, the anger settled into something that was not contentment, but was close to acceptance. Which was, I am here because someone saw what I needed before I saw it myself. And what I needed was to not be tested. He never knew it was Roslin who had made the argument. He found out years later, from Robb, in a conversation over wine, that neither of them intended to be as honest as it became. He said, "Your wife." Robb said, "Yes." He said, "She told you not to send me." Robb said, "She told me to keep you close." Theon was quiet for a long time. He said, "She was right." Robb said, "She's usually right." Theon said, "That must be exhausting." Robb said, "You have no idea." Jaime in Chains. What he saw. 219. Jaime Lannister had been watching the Stark camp for 3 months from the inside of a cell that was better than most cells, which was not saying much but was saying something. He watched because there was nothing else to do, and because watching was how you learned things, and because Jaime had spent 20 years in the Kingsguard watching the court at King's Landing and had developed the specific habit of observation that service in dangerous places produced. He watched Robb. The boy was 16, and he was winning a war, and he was married to a girl he'd known for a month. Jaime had seen kings. Real kings. Established kings. Kings with decades of practice. Handle the pressures of command with less grace than this 16-year-old, and the grace was not the thing that impressed Jaime, because Jaime had seen graceful men who were also terrible. What impressed him was the specific quality of Robb Stark's attention. He listened to people. He listened to his mother and his wife and his lords, and the soldiers who came to him with complaints, and the maesters who came to him with reports. He listened the way Ned Stark had listened, which was completely without the performance of listening that most people substituted for the real thing. He watched Roslin. The Frey girl. Jaime thought of her as the Frey girl at first, because that was how the camp thought of her. The price of the bridge. The girl who'd been traded. He stopped thinking of her that way in the second month, when he heard, from the guards outside his cell, that she had identified a supply problem that had been costing the army 400 bushels of grain per month, and had fixed it by rearranging the storage configuration, which was not a dramatic achievement, and was not the kind of thing that songs were written about, and was the kind of thing that won wars. He watched them together. He watched the distance close. He watched the specific, daily accumulation of two people learning to trust each other, which was visible if you knew what to look for, and which Jaime knew what to look for, because he had spent 20 years watching relationships at court, and had developed the ability to tell the difference between the performed and the real. This was real. When Catelyn Stark came to negotiate his release, the exchange, Jaime for the Stark girls, which Catelyn was managing with the specific competence that Jaime had come to expect from her, he said something he had not planned to say. He said, "He's going to be a good king." She looked at him. He said, "Your son. I've been watching him for 3 months. The way he handles the camp, the way he handles the lords, the way he handles his wife." He stopped. "The wife in particular," she said. "What about his wife?" He said, "She's the best thing in this camp and he knows it. He doesn't perform knowing it. He doesn't make speeches about it or grand gestures. He just listens to her, uses what she gives him, treats the partnership as a partnership." He held her gaze. "I've been watching kings and queens for 20 years, and I have never seen a king treat a queen as an equal in the specific, daily, non-dramatic way that your son treats that girl." Catelyn said, "She's not a girl. She's a Stark." Jaime said, "Yes, I know." He paused. "That's the point. She became a Stark because he let her become one. He didn't make her earn it. He didn't test her. He just opened the door, and she walked through it, and now she's the most valuable person in the room, and everyone knows it." Catelyn looked at him. She said, "You're more observant than I expected." He said, 20 years of watching. You developed the skill." He looked at his chains. "For whatever it's worth, and I know it's worth very little from a man in chains. He's not his father. He's not Robert. He's not Joffrey. He paused. He's something else. Something I don't have a word for yet. She said. The word is reliable. He said. That's not a dramatic word. She said. I know. She stood. It's an accurate one. She left. Shiny sat in his cell. He thought about the word. Reliable. He thought. That's the word I've been looking for my whole life. For the thing I've never been. He thought about it for a long time. King's Landing. What Cersei saw. The ravens from the south told Cersei everything she didn't want to know. She sat in her solar with the reports and read them in the order she always read them, which was worst news first, because Cersei had learned over 30 years that the worst news was the most actionable, and the best news was usually the most misleading. The worst news was the Stark boy had married the Frey girl, and the crossing was secure, and the supply lines were open, and Jaime was in chains, and the riverlands were turning, and the specific architecture of Lannister control south of the neck was coming apart in the methodical way that things came apart when someone competent was pulling them apart. The Bolton arrangement was finished. Cersei had been corresponding with Bolton through Varys, or rather, through the channels she thought were hers, and that were actually Varys's, a distinction she would not discover for another 6 months. And Bolton had gone home and stayed home, and the letters had stopped. She called Tyrion. Tyrion arrived with a cup and the expression of a man who had already read the reports and was waiting to see how long it took her to reach the conclusion he'd reached 3 days ago. She said, "The Frey marriage." He said, "Yes." She said, "He kept the promise." He said, "He did." She said, "He's Ned Stark's son." He said, "In every way that matters." He drank. "The Bolton option is gone. The Frey bridge is locked. The supply lines are..." He paused. "Functioning extremely well, actually. Someone in that camp knows logistics," she said. "We need the Tyrells." He said. "The Tyrells are watching," she said. "They're always watching. Get them to stop watching and start committing." He said. "To us." She looked at him. He said, "Cersei, the question I need to ask, and I know you won't like it, is whether we're trying to win or trying to survive." She said, "Win." He said, "Then I need you to tell me what winning looks like. Because if winning looks like Joffrey on the throne for 30 years... He stopped. "That's not winning. That's a specific kind of losing that looks like winning from the inside." She said, "Don't." He said, "I'm not being cruel. I'm being accurate." He looked at his cup. Joffrey has been king for 4 months. In that time, he has... He stopped again. "You know what he has. You've been managing it. You've been managing it brilliantly, actually. The amount of damage you've prevented is considerable, and nobody gives you credit for it because the damage you've prevented is invisible." She looked at the window. He said, "The North is going to win this war. Not because Robb Stark is a military genius. He might be, but that's not the reason. The North is going to win because the Stark boy married the Frey girl and kept the bridge and dealt with Bolton and has a mother who is managing the political dimension with the specific competence that you and I would give our collective remaining limbs for." He paused. "And he has a wife who is apparently running his logistics better than anyone has run Northern logistics in 50 years. Cersei said, "The Frey girl." Tyrion said, "Don't underestimate her." Cersei said, "She's a Frey." Tyrion said, "She was a Frey. She's a Stark now. And the distance between those two things," he looked at her, "is the entire war." Cersei was quiet. She said, "What do you recommend?" He said, "Open a channel. Not to Robb, to Catelyn. Mother to mother. Catelyn Stark will negotiate. Catelyn Stark is the only person in that camp who understands what negotiation actually costs and is willing to pay it." She said, "You want me to negotiate with the woman whose husband I..." He said, "Whose husband Joffrey executed?" "Yes." He held her gaze. "You didn't do that. Joffrey did. And Catelyn Stark is smart enough to know the difference." She said, "Is she?" He said, "She married her son to a Frey to cross a bridge. She understands the cost of things." He paused. "She'll understand our cost too." Cersei looked at the window for a long time. She said, "Write the letter." he wrote the letter. The camp. What grew? 299 AC. The first time Robb reached for her hand was at a war council. Not during the council, after it. The lords had filed out, and the maps were still on the table, and the specific exhaustion of a 3-hour argument about river crossings was settling on the tent like dust. Roslin had been there. She attended most councils now, sitting to the side the way Catelyn sat to the side, not speaking unless spoken to, but present. And her presence had the specific effect of making the lords slightly more careful about what they said, which was itself useful. The lords left. Robb sat at the table looking at the map of the Riverlands with the expression of someone who had been looking at maps for 4 months and was starting to see the maps when he closed his eyes. Roslin stood to leave. He reached out and caught her hand. Not dramatically, not as a gesture. He just reached, the way you reach for something that's beside you when you need it, the reflexive motion of a hand toward the thing that steadies you. She stopped. She looked at his hand around hers. He looked at it too, as if he was slightly surprised that it had happened. She sat down beside him. Neither of them said anything for a while. The map sat on the table. The Riverlands, the Trident, the roads that his men were marching, and the positions that the Lannister forces were holding, and the specific geography of a war that was being won by a boy and his wife and his mother and 50,000 men who had crossed a bridge because a promise was kept. She said, "You need to sleep." He said, "I know." She said, "You've been awake for..." He said, "I know." She said, "Robb." He said, "5 more minutes." She didn't move her hand. He didn't let go. 5 minutes became 10. They went to the tent together. The distance on the bed had been getting smaller for weeks. Not in any announced way. Not through conversation or declaration, or the specific performance of intimacy that people expected from newlyweds. It had gotten smaller, the way distances got smaller between people who were learning to trust each other. Imperceptibly, continuously, in movements so small that neither person could identify the moment when the distance had become something else. On this night, the distance was gone. Not because of a decision, because there was no distance left to maintain. In the morning, she said, "I didn't know it would feel like this." He said, "Like what?" She said, "Like, not dramatic, not the songs, more like..." She paused. "Like I've been cold and now I'm not." He said, "My father said that about my mother." She said, "He said it felt like not being cold." He said, "I didn't know I was cold until I wasn't." He looked at her. "I always thought that was a strange way to describe it. Now I understand." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "I'm glad you kept the promise." He said, "So am I." Sansa. What changed for her? In King's Landing, Sansa Stark felt the shift. Not in the court's treatment of her. Joffrey was still Joffrey, and the court was still the court, and the specific daily management of being a hostage in a castle full of people who considered you a piece in a game was still the primary activity of her life. The shift was in the report. She had sources. Not many, not the network that someone in a stronger position would have built, but enough. Pia, the serving girl, a cook who had a cousin in the Riverlands who received letters, a guard at the gate who had been born in the north and who told her things by not telling her things, by the specific method of saying sentences loudly enough for her to overhear that were technically addressed to someone else. Through these channels, she learned, Robb had married Roslin Frey. Robb had crossed the bridge. Robb had won at the Whispering Wood. Robb had Jaime Lannister. Robb's wife was pregnant. She sat with each piece of information the way she sat with everything in King's Landing, privately, in her room, with the door latched and the candle low, and the specific discipline of a 13-year-old girl who had learned that showing what you knew was the fastest way to stop knowing it. The pregnancy changed her calculation, not in the way it would have changed the calculation of someone playing the Game of Thrones in the way that Cersei played it, as a question of succession and leverage. The pregnancy changed her calculation because it meant Robb was building something. Not just fighting, building. A family, a future, a thing that would exist after the war was over. she thought. He's going to win, she thought. And when he wins, I need to be useful. She started paying closer attention to the Tyrells. Margaery Tyrell was at court. She had come south with her father's retinue, and she was, Sansa had been watching her for 3 months, the most dangerous person in King's Landing. And she was dangerous precisely because nobody thought she was dangerous. She was pretty, and she was kind, and she said the right things, and she made Joffrey feel important, which was the specific skill that kept you alive near Joffrey. And she did all of this while simultaneously running a parallel operation that Sansa could see and that Cersei couldn't see. And that was going to determine which side the Reach came in on. Sansa made a decision. She went to Margaery. Not openly. She engineered a chance encounter in the gardens, the kind that Margaery would recognize as engineered and would appreciate for the engineering. Because Margaery understood that engineered encounters were how things got done in a court where direct communication was monitored. She said, "Your grandmother is considering the Stark alliance." Margaery looked at her. The kind assessment that Margaery always wore in public shifted slightly, became sharper. The real Margaery behind the performance. She said, "Who told you that?" Sansa said, "Nobody. I can see it. The way your father's letters have changed frequency. The way your grandmother's representative is meeting with people she wasn't meeting with a month ago." She held Margaery's gaze. "I've been watching this court for 6 months, and I've been doing nothing else with my time because there's nothing else I can do. And I notice things." Margaery said, "What do you want?" Sansa said, "I want you to know that Robb will be a good king. Not because he wants to be king. He doesn't. Because he keeps his promises. He married a Frey girl he'd never met because a deal was a deal, and now she's running his supply chain, and they're winning the war." She paused. "That's who he is. That's what you'd be joining." Margaery said, "You're advocating for your brother." Sansa said, "I'm telling you what I know. You can use it or not." Margaery looked at her for a long moment. She said, "How old are you?" Sansa said, 13. Margaery said, "You're not what I expected." Sansa said, "People keep saying that about my family." Something in Margaery's expression that was not quite a smile, and was not quite respect, but was in the territory of both. She said, "Tell me more." Sansa told her more. The Tyrells came in 6 weeks later. Not because of Sansa's conversation. The conversation was one factor among many. But it was a factor. A small push on a scale that was already tilting, applied at the exact moment when the scale was ready to tip. Sansa did not take credit for this. She filed it. She filed it in the part of her mind that was building something, the specific education in how power actually worked, that King's Landing was providing at enormous cost, and that she was determined to make worth the cost. She thought, "I am 13 years old, and I just moved the Tyrells." She thought, "Nobody in this court knows I did that." She thought, "Good. Let them not know." The campaign. The South. 299 AC. With the Tyrells, the arithmetic changed completely. Robb had been winning before. Winning battles, winning ground, winning the specific military engagement that his training and his talent and his mother's political management had made possible. But winning battles and winning wars were different activities, and the difference was the reach. The reach meant grain. The reach meant 30,000 additional swords. The reach meant the specific economic and military weight that turned a rebellion into a credible government, because no one could look at the combined Northern Riverlands Reach alliance and call it a rebellion anymore. It was a coalition. It was, by the standards of the realm, more legitimate than the thing it was fighting. Robb took King's Landing on a Thursday. Not by storm. Catelyn had argued against storm, and Robb had listened, because storming a city killed civilians, and killing civilians was both wrong and strategically foolish, the specific combination that made the argument unanswerable. They took it by pressure. The harbour blockaded, the supply lines cut, the specific slow suffocation that said to the people inside the walls, "This can end whenever the people on the throne decide to end it." The people on the throne decided to end it when the grain ran out. Cersei had prepared. She had gotten Joffrey out. shipped him to Casterly Rock with Myrcella and Tommen, and a retinue in the specific, bitter efficiency of a woman who understood that the game was lost and was saving what she could from the wreckage. She stayed in the Red Keep herself, because someone had to hold the negotiations, and she did not trust anyone else to hold them. She held them with Catelyn, 2 women in a room, the guards outside, the city outside that, the specific quiet of a negotiation between 2 people who understood each other in the way that enemies who were also mothers understood each other. Catelyn said, "The children," Cersei said. "Safe, away from here." Catelyn said, "The terms," Cersei said. "What are you offering?" Catelyn said, "Life, for all of them. Joffrey goes to Essos, not as exile as withdrawal, Myrcella and Tommen as wards in the Westerlands, lords and ladies, not hostages." She held Cersei's gaze. "Cersei, you can go with them, to the Rock, manage their households, be their mother." Cersei said, "You're offering me my children." Catelyn said, "I'm a mother negotiating with a mother. The politics of this are my son's problem. The children are mine." She held the gaze. "Take it." Cersei was quiet for a long time. She said, "He'll make a terrible king." Catelyn said, "He'll make a better king than the alternative, and he has help." Cersei said, "The Frey girl," Catelyn said. "Her name is Roslin." Cersei said, "I know her name." She looked at the table. "She's pregnant," Catelyn said. "Yes," Cersei said. "A Stark heir in a Frey body." Catelyn said, "A child in a woman." She held her gaze. "Take the terms, Cersei, before someone less patient than me takes over the negotiation." Cersei took the terms. King's Landing, the throne room, 299 AC. Robb did not want to sit in the throne. This was not reluctance to power. The power was a fact, and he took facts seriously. It was about the chair itself, the iron monstrosity at the end of the great hall that was made of swords and had been sat in by madmen and drunks and a boy who had cut off Robb's father's head. He stood in front of it. Ghost stood beside him. Catelyn stood behind him. Roslin stood behind Catelyn. The hall was empty except for them. He said, "It's ugly." Catelyn said, "It was designed to be ugly. It was designed to remind the king that ruling is uncomfortable." He said, "Mission accomplished." He sat in it. The iron cut into his back. This was apparently universal. No king in 300 years had found a comfortable position in the Iron Throne, which was either a design philosophy or a curse, and was probably both. He shifted, found the least bad arrangement. He looked at the hall. Empty, dusty, the torches unlit, the windows letting in the flat grey light of an afternoon that didn't care about the change of power that had just happened beneath it. He said, "I need a council." Catelyn said, "I have a list." He said, "Of course you do." She said, "Tyrion Lannister." He looked at her. She said, "For coin. He's the best financial mind in the realm, and he's been writing to me for 2 months, offering his services." He said, "He's a Lannister." She said, "He's a Lannister who has spent 30 years watching his family destroy things and has decided to try building something instead." She held his gaze. "Your father would have used him." He said, "Father would have trusted him?" She said, "Father would have found him useful and watched him while he was useful. That's a different thing from trust." She paused. "Trust comes later. Usefulness is now." He said, "Who else?" She said, "Sansa." He went still. She said, "She's been in this city for 6 months. She's been watching everything. She knows more about how the court works than any of us." She looked at him. "She's 13, and she moved the Torrals." He said, "She what?" She said, "She engineered a meeting with Marguerite Tyrell and laid out the case for the Stark alliance in a way that accelerated the Tyrell decision by approximately 6 weeks." She held his gaze. "Your sister is not the girl who went south. She is considerably more than what she was." He said, "Get her." Catelyn said, "She's already in the castle." She's been reorganizing the domestic arrangements since this morning. Roslin from behind Catelyn. She's efficient. Everyone looked at her. Roslin said, I met her when we arrived. She had the household inventory ready, and the staff assignments prepared, and the specific list of things that needed to happen in what order. She paused. She had it on paper, organized by category. She looked at Robb. She's like your mother. Catelyn looked at Roslin. Roslin held the look. Something passed between them that did not need to be spoken, which was the specific recognition of two women who managed things and who had found each other in the management. Robb said, All right, Sansa on the council. Tyrion for coin. Who else? Catelyn said. Lady Mormont, for the north. He said. She won't come south. Catelyn said. She'll come south if you ask. She'll come south because she wants to make sure the south doesn't ruin you. She paused. She told me that. He said. She told you. Catelyn said. She said, the boy is going to be king, and someone needs to make sure the south doesn't smooth him. Her word. Smooth. He said. All right. He looked at Catelyn. And you? She said. I'm your mother. He said. You're the person who negotiated Cersei's surrender, managed the Tyrell alliance, brokered the Frey marriage, and has been running the political dimension of this war since it started. He held her gaze. I need a hand. She said. That's it. Traditionally, he said. Traditionally a man. I know. He looked at the empty hall. Do you see any traditions working particularly well around here? She said. Robb, he said. Mother. You're the best person for it. Everyone knows it. I know it. Roslin knows it. The lords know it, even if they won't say it. He paused. Say yes. She was quiet for a long time. She said, Your father would have an opinion about this. He said, Father would say, do the right thing. He looked at her. This is the right thing. She said, Yes. He said, Yes, you'll do it? She said, Yes. Ghost's tail moved. Roslin, still standing behind everyone, said, The kitchens need restocking. I'm going to deal with that while you sort out the realm. She left. Robb watched her go. He said, to the empty hall and his mother and the wolf, How did I get this lucky? Catelyn said, You kept a promise. He said, That's it. She said, That's everything. Arya. The Return. 229 AC. She walked into King's Landing on a Tuesday. Nobody had sent for her. Nobody had known where she was. Robb had sent riders, and Catelyn had sent ravens, and Varys had sent inquiries, and all of them had come back with fragments, seen in the Riverlands, travelling with a large man, armed, dangerous. The dangerous part everyone believed. She walked through the gate with the hound beside her, a needle at her hip, and the specific expression of someone who had been walking for a long time, and had stopped noticing. The gate guard stopped her. She told him who she was. He didn't believe her. She waited, patient, while he sent for someone senior. Robb came himself. He came down from the Red Keep at a walk that became a run, and he stopped in front of her and looked at her, and she looked at him. She had been 9 when he left. The 9-year-old who had hidden Needle under her bed and chased cats through the corridors and pestered Jon about sword forms. She was not 9 anymore. She said, You got taller. He said, You got... She said, Don't say older. He said, Scarier. She almost smiled. Almost. She said, Where's Roslin? He blinked. You know about... She said, Everyone knows about Roslin. You married a Frey girl at a bridge, and she's running your logistics, and she's pregnant. She looked at him. The Brotherhood talked about it. They thought it was funny. The young wolf marrying for a bridge. She paused. I told them it wasn't funny. I told them it was the most Stark thing anyone had done since Father. He looked at her. She said, It is. It's exactly what Father would have done. She held his gaze. He married Mother for the same reason. Because the Alliance needed it. Because the promise was the promise. He said, "How did you... You were 8 when..." She said, "I listened. I always listened." She looked at the castle behind him. "Can I meet her?" he said. "Roslin," she said, "I want to meet the woman who married my brother for a bridge and stayed for..." She stopped. "Whatever this is," he said. "This is... We're..." She said, "Happy? You're happy. I can see it. You don't know how to say it because Starks don't say it, but you're happy, and I can see it, and I want to meet the person who did that." He brought her to Roslin. Roslin was in the kitchens, which was where Roslin was when she wasn't in the supply rooms or the council chamber, or the specific administrative corners of the Red Keep that she had claimed through the sheer force of being useful in them. She was directing the restocking with the quiet authority of someone who had been directing things for years and had gotten very good at making the directing look like suggesting. Arya stood in the doorway. Roslin turned. She looked at Arya. Arya looked at her. Arya said, "You're smaller than I thought," Roslin said. "People say that," Arya said. "And," Roslin said, "and I managed a household of 800 people for 3 years. Size hasn't been relevant." Something crossed Arya's face that was not quite approval and not quite recognition and was close to both. She said, "Robb is lucky," Roslin said. "He's reliable. That's different from lucky." Arya said, "Both can be true." Roslin said, "Yes, both can be true." The Hound, behind Arya, looked at the kitchens with the expression of a man who had not eaten properly in several months and was performing indifference to the smell of bread very badly. Roslin said, "Your friend is hungry." Arya said, "He's not my friend." Roslin said, "He's hungry regardless." She looked at the Hound. "Sit down. There's bread, and there's stew, and there's no one watching." The Hound sat down. He ate. He did not say thank you, which was apparently how the Hound thanked people, by accepting the thing without commenting on it. Arya watched this with the expression of someone filing information. She said to Roslin, "You know how to handle difficult men." Roslin said, "My father is Walder Frey." Arya said, "Fair point." They looked at each other. Something settled between them that wasn't friendship yet, but was the foundation for it, which was mutual recognition of competence. It would do for now. The first year, what Robb built, 300 a sea. The first year was the hardest year. Not because they were losing. They had won, the war was over in the military sense. The Lannisters were at the Rock, and the throne was occupied, and the realm was technically at peace. The first year was hard, because peace was harder than war in every way that mattered, and in several ways that nobody had warned him about. War had the specific clarity of a problem with a shape. The enemy was there. Your men were here. The terrain told you what was possible, and the numbers told you what was probable, and the decision was between options that could be evaluated. Peace had none of that. Peace was a city that hated you because you'd starved it into submission and was only not rioting because the Tyrell grain had arrived. Peace was 7 kingdoms of lords who had been on 5 different sides of a war, and all of them had grievances, and all of them wanted something, and the something was usually incompatible with what the lord next to them wanted. Peace was a small council that met every morning and argued about things Robb didn't know enough about, and where the argument was not between right and wrong, but between 3 kinds of right that were all slightly wrong. He got better. Not immediately. Not in the way that songs described, the montage of a young king growing into his crown. He got better the way people got better at things. By doing them badly, and then less badly, and then adequately. And then, on certain days, in certain moments. Well, Catelyn helped. She was the hand, and she was the best hand the Iron Throne had had in living memory, which she accomplished by being the specific thing that hands were supposed to be, and almost never were, which was the person who told the king what the king didn't want to hear and made the king hear it anyway. She told Robb that his instinct to be generous was both his best quality and his most dangerous one. She told him that the lords who came to him with the most elaborate shows of loyalty were frequently the least loyal. She told him that the Iron Bank needed to be managed before it needed to be paid, and that Tyrion was the right person for the managing, because Tyrion had been trained by Tywin Lannister, and Tywin Lannister was the only person the Iron Bank had ever been slightly afraid of. She told him, "Your father was a great man, but he was not a great politician. He was great despite his politics. You need to be great because of them." He listened. Sansa managed the court. This was the work that nobody saw and everyone benefited from. The specific social infrastructure of a capital city, the relationships and channels, and the off-the-record conversations where the actual decisions were made. She had mapped these channels during her 6 months as Joffrey's hostage, and she deployed the map with the precise competence of someone who had paid an enormous price for the information and was determined to get value from it. She was 14 by the time the court was running. She looked older. She acted older. She had the specific quality of someone who had been aged by circumstances and had decided to make the aging useful rather than tragic. Tyrion managed the money. He was the best financial mind available, and the fact that he was a Lannister managing the Stark treasury produced the specific irony that Tyrion found sustaining, the kind of irony that kept you interested in a job that would otherwise have been merely difficult. He came to Robb on a Tuesday in the 3rd month. He said, "The debt." Robb said, "Which one?" He said, "The Lannister debt. The one Robert built. The one my father managed. The one that is currently—" He looked at a number on the paper in his hand. "Large," Robb said. "How large?" Tyrion told him. Robb was quiet. Tyrion said, "I can manage it. That's what I'm here for. But I need you to understand what management looks like, which is, we don't pay it off in a year. We restructure it. We renegotiate the terms. We turn a crisis into a schedule." He looked at Robb. "Your wife has been helpful with this, incidentally." Robb said. "Roslin?" Tyrion said. "She has an instinct for numbers that I find." He paused. "Impressive, actually. She identified 3 discrepancies in the revenue reports that my own people missed. She grew up managing Walder Frey's accounts, which is apparently the equivalent of financial combat training." Robb said. "She told me about the discrepancies." Tyrion said. "She told you before she told me." Robb said. "She tells me everything." Tyrion looked at him. He said, "That is—" He stopped. "That is the most valuable thing a king can have. Not intelligence, not counsel. Someone who tells you everything." He went back to the numbers. Lady Mormont came south, as she had said she would, with the specific energy of a woman who had decided that the South needed supervision, and she was the person to provide it. She sat on the council, and she said what she thought, and she did not soften it. And her lack of softening was itself a kind of service, because it meant that at least one person in the room was saying the thing that was true, rather than the thing that was comfortable. She and Roslin developed an understanding. Not friendship. Lady Mormont did not do friendship in the way that other people did friendship. She did recognition. She recognized competence and she recognized character, and when she found both in the same person, she acknowledged it by treating that person the way she treated everyone else, which was directly, without ceremony, without the specific padding that most people put around difficult truths. She said to Roslin in the 2nd month, "You're managing the household accounts and the supply logistics and the domestic staff, and you're pregnant." Roslin said, "Yes." Lady Mormont said, "You need an assistant." Roslin said, "I'm managing." Lady Mormont said, "You're managing now. In 3 months, you'll be managing with a child. In 6 months, you'll be managing with a child and the recovery. You need an assistant now, so the assistant knows the systems before you need the assistant to run them." Roslin looked at her. She said, "That's actually good advice." Lady Mormont said, "It's not advice. It's an instruction." She paused. "I've managed Bear Island through 4 pregnancies. The trick is delegation before the delegation is urgent." Roslin said, "You managed Bear Island while pregnant." Lady Mormont said, "Bear Island doesn't stop needing management because you're having a baby. Neither does a kingdom." She held her gaze. "Get the assistant." Roslin got the assistant. Roslin, what she carried. 300 AC. The baby came in the 6th month of the reign. A boy. Small and red and furious in the way that newborns were furious, with the specific indignation of someone who had been in a warm place and was now in a cold one, and had opinions about the change. They named him Eddard. Not because they had discussed it extensively. They had discussed it once, briefly, in the way they discuss most things, which was one of them said the right thing, and the other one agreed because it was obviously the right thing, and the discussion was over. Robb had said, Eddard. Roslin had said, yes. That was the discussion. The boy had Stark colouring and Frey eyes, which was a combination that nobody had seen before, and that Meister, the Red Keep's Meister, who had been through 3 kings and was not easily impressed, said was unusual in a way he could not specify, but that made him want to look at the child longer than he looked at most children. Walder Frey sent a raven. The raven said in Walder Frey's hand, which was shaky and terrible, and communicated the specific energy of a 90-year-old man who was experiencing something he had never in his life expected to experience, which was satisfaction. My grandson. Named for a Stark. Named for the man who never walked past my bridge without looking down at it. Named for the man who made my daughter's husband possible. I am pleased. This was the most emotion Walder Frey had expressed in writing in 90 years. Catelyn read it and showed it to Robb, and Robb showed it to Roslin, and Roslin looked at it for a long time. She said, he's never said he was pleased about anything. Robb said, he's pleased about this. She said, he's pleased because his blood is in Winterfell, and his grandson is named Eddard, and the thing he wanted for 90 years is real. She looked at the baby. This is what he traded me for. She paused. I used to resent that. He said, and now? She said, now I think... She looked at the baby, who was asleep in the specific boneless way that newborns slept, as though the concept of muscle tone had not yet been explained to him. Now I think the trade was the start of everything, the thing that made the rest possible. She held his gaze. I don't resent the start anymore. I'm too busy being grateful for where it went. He looked at her. He thought about his father. About Ned Stark marrying Catelyn Tully because his brother was dead and the alliance was needed. About what Ned had built from that start. About the specific Stark quality of turning obligations into foundations and foundations into homes. He said, I love you. He had not said it before. He had shown it, in the reaching, in the staying, in the 100 daily acts of attention that were what love looked like, when it was building rather than arriving. But he had not said the words because the words were large, and he had not been certain they were the right words until this moment, which was a Tuesday afternoon in a room in the Red Keep with a sleeping baby, and a woman who had been traded for a bridge and had turned the trade into the foundation of everything. She looked at him. She said, I know. He said, I should have said it earlier. She said, you said it with your hands. Every time you reached for me at the mat. Every time you came back from the field and found me first. She held his gaze. The words are nice. The reaching was the thing. He said, when did you? She said, no. He said, yes. She said, the night I told you about Bolton. You lay in the dark, and you didn't ask me if I was sure. You didn't ask me if I was making trouble. You didn't question me. She paused. You believed me. That was when. He said, that's an early answer. She said, I've had a lot of time to think about it. The baby made a sound, the small, purposeless sound of a child who was asleep and wanted everyone to know it. They sat with the baby between them. Outside, King's Landing went about its afternoon. Inside, 2 people who had been traded for a bridge were sitting with their son and the specific quiet that was not silence, but peace. The Godswood. Roslin and the North, 300 AC. She went to the Godswood on a Sunday evening. Not the King's Landing Godswood, The proper one at Winterfell, because they had gone north for the baby's naming ceremony, and because Robb had said, he should see Winterfell. He should see the Godswood. And she had agreed, because the baby should see these things, and also because she had never been to Winterfell, and she wanted to see the place that had built the man she had married. Winterfell was not what she expected. She had expected cold. It was the north. Cold was assumed. She had expected stone, grey and heavy and northern in the way that northern things were northern. She had expected the kind of castle that made you feel small. What she found was warm. The hot springs running through the walls, the specific thermal engineering of a castle that had been built 8,000 years ago by people who understood that surviving the cold was not about resisting it, but about working with it. The walls were warm to the touch. The floors were warm underfoot. The entire castle was heated from below by something ancient and reliable, and entirely northern. She stood in the Godswood and looked at the heart tree. The face carved in it looked back. She had been raised in the faith of the Seven. The twins had a sept, a proper sept, with the proper icons and the proper ceremonies, because Walder Frey had hedged his religious bets the way he hedged everything else. She had prayed in the sept her whole life, and had found the praying useful in the way that organized repetition was useful. It gave shape to the day, and it gave you something to do with the fear. The Godswood was different. The Godswood didn't organize anything. It didn't provide structure or ceremony or the specific reassurance of a formal practice. It provided something else, which was presence. The tree was there. The face was there. The pool was there. And if you sat with them long enough, which she did, on the stone beside the pool in the cold northern afternoon, something happened that was not prayer and was not meditation and was closer to the thing that happened when she sat with the supply ledgers for long enough that the numbers stopped being numbers and became a picture. She understood, sitting there, what the north was, not the geography, not the cold or the stone or the snow that Robb talked about with the specific homesickness of a man who had been south for a year and missed the specific quality of northern light. The north was a way of being. It was the thing that the Godswood was, present, patient, not performing anything. The north sat with things. The north waited. The north didn't explain itself because the north didn't think explanation was necessary. You either understood or you didn't, and if you didn't, the north was not going to bend itself into your understanding. She had spent 17 years in the Twins, which was a house that was constantly explaining itself. Walder Frey explained his grievances. The siblings explained their positions. The household explained its hierarchies. Everything was explained because nothing was secure, and the explaining was a way of establishing what should have been established by the thing itself. The North didn't do that. She sat in the Godswood and she thought, I have been a Stark for 8 months, and I am only now understanding what that means. She thought, it means you stop explaining and start being. She thought, the supply chain doesn't need explanation. It works or it doesn't. The marriage doesn't need explanation. It holds or it doesn't. The promise doesn't need explanation. It's kept or it isn't. She thought, Robb kept the promise. I built on what the keeping produced. Neither of us explained it to anyone because neither of us needed to. The baby, Eddard, little Ned, the boy with the Stark colouring and the Frey eyes, was asleep against her chest in the sling she carried him in. He was 3 months old, and he slept with the absolute commitment of a person who had decided that sleeping was his primary occupation and was dedicated to it. She looked at the heart tree. She said, I'm not from here. The face looked back. She said, but I think I'm supposed to be here. The face didn't answer. Faces in trees didn't answer. That was the point of them. They were there, and they listened, and the listening was the thing. She sat until the light changed. Then she went inside. She went to find Robb, who was in the hall with the lords who had come for the naming, doing the specific political work of being a king in his own castle, which he did with the particular quality of a man who was in the place he was built for and knew it. She didn't interrupt. She sat at the back with the baby and watched him work. the way she had been watching him work since the first morning at the Twins when he had crossed the hall and said the honest thing. He looked up. Found her. Something in his face that happened when he found her in a room. Not relief exactly, not joy exactly, but the specific settling of a man who had located the thing that made the room make sense. She held his gaze. He went back to the Lords. She went back to watching. The baby slept. Winterfell held. The wall. What nobody forgot. Robb had been reading the Night's Watch reports. Not because anyone had told him to. Catelyn had been routing the official reports to the council, where they were processed in the way that alarming reports from distant places were always processed, which was noted, filed, deferred. The South had always deferred the North. The North had always deferred the Wall. The Wall had always deferred the thing beyond it. Deferral was the realm's primary strategy for dealing with problems that were too large and too far away to feel immediate. Robb read them anyway. He read them because he was Ned Stark's son, and Ned Stark had taken him to the Wall when he was 7 and had stood with him at the top and had looked north and had said, "This is real. Whatever the Masters say, whatever the South says, this is real, and someday someone is going to have to deal with it." He had been 7. He had looked at the north stretching away to the horizon, and he had believed his father, because he always believed his father. Now he was king. Now dealing with it was his job. He called the Lords to Castle Black. Not to King's Landing. Not to a comfortable hall in the south where the wall was an abstraction. To the wall itself, where the 700 feet of ancient ice made the argument that no words could make. He brought them up. The lift. The cold. The world opening up and the north stretching away, and the specific silence of a place that was too large for human conversation. He stood at the top with Roslin beside him. She had come. He had not asked her to come. He had mentioned the trip and she had said, "I'm coming." He had said, "The baby." And she had said, "Sansa has the baby. Your mother has the household. I'm coming." She stood at the top of the wall and looked north. She said, "This is what he was afraid of." He said, "Father?" She said, "My father." She looked at him. Walder Frey has been sitting at the Twins for 90 years, and he's been afraid of this his whole life. Not the cold, the thing in the cold. He'd never say it. He'd never admit he believed in anything larger than his own grudges. But the Twins are on the only bridge south, and he's spent 90 years making sure he controls the escape route. Robb looked at her. She said, "He didn't build a castle at the bridge because of the toll revenue. He built it because it's the choke point, the place where anyone going south has to go through. If something comes from the north..." She held his gaze. The Twins exist because someone, a long time ago, was planning for a retreat. He thought about this. He thought about Walder Frey sitting in his castle with his daughters and his grievances and his bridge. And he thought about whether the 90 years of spite were actually 90 years of fear, and whether the fear was more respectable than the spite, and whether it mattered which one it was if the result was the same. He said, "We go north." She said, "When?" He said, "Spring, when the pass is clear." She said, "You and who?" He said, "Everyone I can convince." She looked north for a long time. She said, "I'll have the supply chain ready." He said, "For an army?" She said, "For whatever you need." She looked at him. "That's my job. You tell me what you need, and I make sure it exists." She paused. "I've been doing it since we crossed the bridge." He said, "I know." She said, "Then trust it." He did. Robb and Catelyn. The night before the ranging. 300 AC. She found him at the wall after supper. Not at the top. He was at the base of it, leaning against the ancient ice with Ghost beside him, looking at the gate that led north. The gate was closed. In the morning it would open and he would go through it with 1,000 men and the dragon glass they had been mining from Dragonstone for 6 months and the Valyrian steel they had been redistributing from every great house that had it. She sat beside him. Ghost looked at her. She looked at Ghost. She said, "I want to say some things." He said, "All right." She said, "I made a deal at a bridge because I needed the bridge. I traded a girl I had never met for a crossing, and I told myself it was necessary, and it was necessary, and it was also—" She paused. "It was also the thing that made everything else possible. The marriage, Roslin, the boy, the campaign, the throne. All of it traces back to that bridge and that deal and that girl standing in a doorway looking afraid." He said, "She wasn't afraid of me." She said, "She was afraid of everything. She was 17, and she'd been living in Walder Frey's castle her whole life, and she was given to a stranger for a war she didn't start." She held his gaze. "And she turned out to be the best thing that happened to this family since I married your father." He was quiet. She said, "Your father and I, we started the same way. He didn't choose me. I didn't choose him. Brandon was supposed to marry me, and Brandon died, and Ned showed up, and he was quiet. Difficult to read. Not what I'd expected." She paused. "Not what I'd wanted." He said, "What changed?" She said, "He did the work. He paid attention. He was honest when honesty was more expensive than performance. And he chose honesty every time." She held his gaze. "You did the same thing. With Roslin. You walked across the hall. You slept on your side of the bed. You listened when she talked about grain storage." She paused. The love came from the listening. He said, "You said that before." She said, "I'm saying it again, because you're about to go north, and I want you to remember what you have to come back to." He looked at her. She said, "Come back." He said, "I will." She said, "Not trying. Not intending." "Come back." He said, "I'll come back." She said, "Your son needs a father. Your wife needs—" She stopped. "Your wife doesn't need anything from anyone, actually. She's the most self-sufficient person I've ever met, and I include myself in that assessment." She paused. "But she wants you. That's different from needing. And it's better." He said, "Mother." She said, "I know. I'm being—" She stopped. "I'm being a mother. It's what I have." He put his hand on hers. They sat at the base of the wall in the cold. Ghost lay across both their feet. The north was on the other side of the gate. In the morning he would go into it. Tonight he would sit with his mother and his wolf, and the specific northern quiet that was not silence but readiness. Sawari. Robb and Roslin, the morning. 300 AC. She came to him before dawn. The camp was still asleep. The specific, heavy sleep of men who knew they were going somewhere dangerous in the morning and had made their peace with it by sleeping harder than they normally would. She found him at the horse lines, checking tack, which was what Robb did when he couldn't sleep before a march. Check the things that other people were paid to check, because the checking gave him something to do with his hands, while his mind did the other thing. She stood beside him. He said, "You should be sleeping." She said, "I should be wherever I want to be. I want to be here." He looked at her. She said, "The supply chain is ready. 2 months of provisions staged at 3 points along the route. The dragon glass is packed in reinforced crates. I made them redesign the crates. The first ones were going to crack in the cold. The replacement horses are at the halfway station." She paused. "The medical supplies are packed by severity. The heaviest cases can be treated at the first station. The lighter ones can wait for the second." He said, "You organized the medical supplies by severity." She said, "I organized everything. That's what I do." She held his gaze. "You fight the war. I make sure the war has what it needs to be fought." He said, "I know." She said, "Then come back and tell me what else we need." He said, "Roslin," she said, "don't say goodbye. Don't say, be careful. Don't say any of the things that people say when they're performing the leaving." She held his gaze. "Just come back. Come back with a list of what you need for next time. Come back with intelligence about the terrain. Come back with your men and your wolf and whatever information the North is willing to give you. He said, "And if," she said, "there is no if. You are coming back because you are Robb Stark, and you are the most reliable person I have ever known, and reliable people come back." She paused. That's not faith. That's observation. He looked at her. He thought about the girl standing in the doorway at the twins. The girl with her hands clasped in front of her, afraid, managing the fear. The girl who had been sent to him by a father who saw her as a prize. He thought about the woman standing beside him now, who had organized the supply chain for arranging beyond the wall and redesigned the crates for the dragon glass and staged medical supplies by severity, and who was not asking him to stay, but was telling him to come back, which was the difference between need and faith, and she had chosen faith. He said, "I'm glad I kept the promise." She said, "You keep saying that." He said, "I'm going to keep saying it." She said, "Good." He kissed her. Not the performance of a departure, not the dramatic kiss at the gate with the army watching. A private thing, in the dark, with the horses. He went to saddle his horse. She went to check the supply manifest one more time. In the morning, through the gate, into the north. Ghost ran ahead. Beyond the wall, what they found. 300 AC. They went north. What they found was what the reports had been saying for 30 years, and what the South had been ignoring for 30 years, and what the wall had been holding for 8,000. The cold was wrong. The cold had a direction. The cold was not weather. The ranging lasted 2 weeks and cost them 11 men and produced the first confirmed engagement between the army of the living and the army of the dead in 8,000 years. It was not a battle. It was a skirmish. A patrol that encountered something in a clearing that the maps called the Haunted Forest and that earned the name. The dead came out of the trees, and the dragon glass worked, and the Valyrian steel worked, and the 11 men who died taught the remaining 989 what they were fighting and what worked against it and what didn't. Robb stood in the clearing afterward. He looked at the frost that moved wrong, and the trees that were touched by something that altered what it touched, and the specific evidence of a presence that had been here, and had retreated, but had not gone far. He thought, Father was right. He thought, this is real. He thought, and now I know what to do about it. He went home. He went home with the intelligence and the list and the specific grim certainty of a man who had seen the thing and could no longer pretend the thing was not there, and he brought it back to the people who were going to help him deal with it. He brought it back to Roslin. She read the reports. She read them the way she read everything, completely, filing the information, building the logistics picture that would support whatever came next. She looked at the casualty numbers and the supply consumption rates and the specific data about what worked and what didn't, and she started building the plan for the next ranging before he asked her to. She said, "We need more dragon glass." He said, "I know," she said. "The Dragonstone mines can increase production by 40% if we send another team. I've already identified the team." He said, "You identified the team?" She said, "While you were gone, I had time." She looked at him. "I also identified 3 lords in the Reach who have Valyrian steel they're not using, and who might be willing to contribute it for the right consideration." She paused. "I wrote the letters. I didn't send them. That's your decision." He said, "Send them." She said, "Done." She looked at the reports again. 11 men. He said, "Yes." She said, "Names." He said, "I have them." She said, "Letters to the families." He said, "I'll write them tonight." She said, "I'll have the compensation packages ready in the morning. 3 years of wages for each family. That's the standard I'm proposing." He said, 3 years is generous." She said, 3 years is correct." She held his gaze. "These men died for a war that most of the realm doesn't believe exists. Their families deserve more than the standard." She paused. "The generosity isn't a cost. It's an investment. When we go back, and we will go back, we need volunteers. Volunteers come from families who were treated well. He looked at her. He said, "You're thinking 3 moves ahead." She said, "Someone has to." He said, "My mother thinks 3 moves ahead." She said, "Your mother thinks 3 moves ahead politically. I think 3 moves ahead logistically." She paused. "Together we cover most of the board," he said. "Roslin." She said, "Yes." He said, "When I was at the ford, at the Mummers Ford, before we came south, I thought, I am 16 years old, and I am going to do this because it needs doing, and I am terrified." He looked at her. "I'm not terrified anymore," she said. "Because you've gotten braver?" He said, "Because I'm not alone in it." He held her gaze. The fear didn't go away. The aloneness did. She looked at him. She didn't say anything. She reached across the table and took his hand. They sat with the reports between them and the war ahead of them, and the specific quiet of 2 people who had been doing this together long enough that the together had become the thing rather than the doing. The record, what Robb wrote. 301 AC. He wrote it himself. Not the official version. The Meisters would produce that later, polished and authorized and simplified in the way that official histories were simplified until the interesting parts were gone. He wrote the real one. He wrote, "My father made a promise to my mother at a wedding that neither of them had chosen. He kept it. He built from it a family and a north that worked." He wrote, "I made a promise to a lord at a bridge. I kept it. I married a girl I had never met because the bridge was necessary, and the promise was the promise, and I had been taught by my father that promises kept were the foundation of everything else." He wrote, "The girl turned out to be the best thing that happened to me." He wrote the names. Not just the lords. Every soldier, every ranger, every person who had stood at the wall and looked north and decided to go through the gate. He wrote the names of the 11 men who had died in the first ranging, and the families who had received the letters, and the specific cost of the thing they were doing. He wrote about Roslin. He wrote, "She reorganized the supply chain in the first month. She identified Bolton's treachery by pouring wine and paying attention. She built the logistics for the campaign south, and the logistics for the campaign north, and she did both of them while pregnant, and she did not complain about any of it, because complaining was not something she had time for." He wrote, "She was traded for a bridge. She turned the trade into everything." He wrote, "I did not deserve this. Nobody deserves this. You don't deserve the thing that saves you. You receive it, and you honor it, and you build on it, and that's all you can do." He showed it to Catelyn. She read it. She put it down. She said, "Your father would be proud." He said, "Of me?" She said, "Of all of it. Of you. Of Roslin. Of the fact that you kept the promise." She looked at the document. "He kept his promise too. When he married me. He kept it every day for 20 years. She paused. "That's the Stark way, not the grand gesture. The daily keeping." He said, "The daily keeping?" She said, "Yes." He looked at the document. He said, "I want Roslin to read this." She said, "She should." He said, "She'll be embarrassed." She said, "She'll be..." She paused. "She'll see herself the way you see her. That's not embarrassment. That's recognition." He took the document. He went to find his wife. What if Robb Stark married Roslin Frey? He did it because his mother made a deal at a bridge, and his father had taught him that deals, once made, were kept. He did it without wanting to, and without resentment, and without the specific performance of sacrifice that would have made the doing about him, rather than about the promise. He walked across the hall so she wouldn't have to. He slept on his side of the bed until the distance closed on its own. He listened when she told him about Bolton, and he believed her. And the believing saved his life, and the lives of everyone who depended on him. She reorganized his supply chain. She managed his camp. She built the logistics for 2 campaigns, one south and one north. And she raised a son, and she ran a household, and she did none of it because she was asked, and all of it because she saw what needed doing and did it, which was the Stark way, even though she had been born a Frey. She had been traded for a bridge. She built a kingdom. The promise that was supposed to be a cage turned out to be a door. The marriage that was supposed to be a price turned out to be a partnership. The girl who had been standing in a doorway, with her hands clasped in front of her, turned out to be the most capable person in a room full of capable people. And the boy who had walked across the hall to meet her turned out to be someone who understood that the walking across was the whole thing. Not the crown, not the war, not the throne room, or the council, or the negotiations, or the battles. The walking across, the reaching for the hand at the maps, the daily keeping of the promise that started everything. Ned Stark married Catelyn Tully because his brother was dead and the alliance was needed. He built from that a 20-year love and 5 children, and a north that worked. Robb Stark married Roslin Frey because his mother made a deal at a bridge. He built from that a war won and a realm held and a partnership that the histories would spend decades trying to explain, and that was, in the end, not complicated at all. He kept the promise. She kept everything else. The north held. The morning after, what it looked like. On a Tuesday morning in the 2nd year of the reign, Robb Stark came to the small council chamber and found his wife already there. She was at the table with 3 documents spread in front of her and a cup of tea that had gone cold because she had forgotten about it, which was how she drank tea, with the specific inattention of a person whose attention was entirely committed to something more interesting than tea. He sat across from her. She didn't look up. He waited. She said without looking up. The Dragonstone shipment is 2 weeks behind schedule because the harbour master at Duskendale is skimming a tariff that doesn't exist. He said. Good morning, she said. The tariff is costing us 1,100 bushels per shipment. Over 3 months, that's. She looked up. Good morning, he said. Tea's cold. She looked at the cup. Yes, he said. I'll get you another, she said. After the harbour master, he said. Roslin, she said. The harbour master first. He said. I'll deal with the harbour master. Drink tea. Eat something. He held her gaze. The realm will survive 15 minutes of you not managing it, she said. You don't know that, he said. I'm reasonably confident, she said. Reasonably, he said. Mostly. Something in her face that was the specific Roslin expression. Not quite a smile. Not quite exasperation. The thing between them that was both, and that had been developing since the twins. Since the doorway. Since the first morning when she had told him there was food in his tent, and he should eat before he did whatever came next. She put down the documents. She picked up the tea. She drank it cold. He said, That's disgusting. She said, It's efficient. He said, Those are not mutually exclusive. She said, They are when you have a harbour master to deal with. He looked at her. She looked at him. The council chamber was empty except for them. The morning light was coming through the windows in the specific grey way of a southern morning that was never going to be a northern morning, and that they had both stopped expecting it to be. Ghost was somewhere in the castle doing whatever Ghost did when the humans were doing administrative work, which was generally sleeping in hallways and making guards uncomfortable. He said, My father used to do this. She said, Drink cold tea. He said, Sit in the council chamber before anyone else arrived. He'd be there at dawn with the reports and the letters and the cup that had gone cold because he'd forgotten about it. He paused. My mother would come in and tell him to eat something, and he'd say after the petitions, and she'd say, The petitions will survive 15 minutes. She was quiet. He said, I didn't understand until now what that meant. I thought it was a routine. Something married people did. The husband worked. The wife manages the husband. She said, And now? He said, Now I understand it was the thing itself. The work together. The sitting in the room before anyone else arrived and doing the thing that needed doing. Side by side. He held her gaze. That's the marriage. Not the ceremony. Not the promise. The sitting in the room. She looked at him. She said, "The girl who stood in the doorway at the twins would not have understood what you just said." He said, "And now?" She said, "Now I'm the one with the cold tea, and the harbour master, and the 15 minutes that the realm can survive without me." He said, "So you understand?" She said, "I understand." She picked up the document. "Now deal with the harbour master, so I can fix the Dragonstone shipment." He took the documents. He went to deal with the harbour master. She went to fix the shipment. Later, after the council, after the petitions, after the 17 things that needed doing before noon, they would find each other in the same room again. Not arranged, not scheduled, the way two people who had been doing this for 2 years found each other. By gravity. The specific gravity of two people who had been traded for a bridge and had turned the trade into a marriage, and the marriage into a partnership, and the partnership into the thing that held the realm together. Not love first, not love as the starting condition. Love as the thing that was built, brick by brick, conversation by conversation, cold cup of tea by cold cup of tea, from the raw material of a promise kept and a hall crossed and a distance closed. That kind of love. The Ned and Catelyn kind, the Stark kind.